grade 5 students. Once again, this is your teacher in grade 5, Science, Miss Laura, greeting you a scientific day. So for today, we are going to have the session 3 for this week's lessons. So I hope everyone is excited and I hope the lessons that we will learn for this day will be used in our daily lives. So let's not wait any further. Let's start. We will always start with the science bits. This reminds you that for whosoever be the next science bits reporter, please be ready. We're going to be having the recall on reproduction in flowering plants, discussion on reproduction in non-flowering plants, activity on reproduction in non-flowering plants, and of course, thumbs it for our wrap-up. Let us now have a recall on the reproduction in flowering plants. Flowering plants or the angiosperm reproduce through pollination. And after pollination, eventually, it will lead the plants or the ovules into fertilized seed. And that is what we call fertilization. Plants are not only flowering or angiosperm. Plants can also be non-flowering or it is called gymnosperm. And that is what we are going to talk about for today. Our lesson is all about reproduction in non-flowering plants. And our learning targets are: I can identify and describe the different methods of reproduction in non-flowering plants. I can describe the mode of reproduction of moss and fern. Plants are not only reproduced sexually, they are also produced asexually. This asexual reproduction is called vegetative reproduction, which are very common or vivid to roots, stem, and leaves. When we say vegetative reproduction, it is the process wherein some plants reproduce with their stems, roots, and leaves. This type of reproduction is considered as asexual reproduction. They doesn't need seeds. Therefore, there is no union of sperm cell and an egg cell that takes place. But then there are also methods in producing new plants using asexual reproduction or asexual method, which is the vegetative reproduction. We call them natural and artificial vegetative reproduction. Natural reproduction is a structural modification is done. The stem, the root, or leaf of a herbaceous or woody plant, wherein artificial is artificially propagated, or we considered it cloning. Let us try to discuss what are the different methods in vegetative reproduction. As you notice in the picture, we have lily, leek, garlic, and camps, an example of these products or these vegetables. So these vegetables are called bulb. They are being reproduced in these ways. So they are naturally reproduced with the use of the bulb of the plant. So a round fleshy stem found underneath the ground surrounded by fleshy leaves. Bulb stores nutrients for the plants. Plants can grow from these bulbs by simply taking one bulb from a plant and planting it. Onion, garlic, and lilies grow from bulbs. Another example of natural vegetative reproduction is in bananas or banana trees. These banana trees are small plant that grows around the main plant. So they have what we call, or they are considered to be called, shoots or suckers. So they grow around the main plant and grow on their own and can eventually separated to the main plant. We also have these kinds of plants wherein first we have root crops. These root crops are called tubers or tuber. A tuber is an enlarged portion of an underground stem that contains stored food. White potatoes are tubers. Along the surface of the tubers have scald or have holes called eyes. These eyes are actually tiny buds. When a farmer plants white potatoes, the tuber is cut into pieces, each piece having at least one eye. Each eye develops into a shoot that grows upward through the soil. And these also produce roots. The young shoot uses and stored food of the tuber until it develops sufficiently to carry on photosynthesis. Another example of natural vegetative production happens to strawberries. They are called runners or stolons. So these are horizontal stem with buds, and they grow along the surface of the ground. They grow where the ground is in. So where the bud from the runner touches the soil, roots, stems, and leaves develop to form a new independent plant. Bermuda grass and Carabao grass are considered to be runners or stolon. Another example of natural vegetative reproduced plants are the ginger and of course bamboos. They are called rhizomes, where stems grows horizontally underground, and they have these what we call nodes. These nodes are the enlarged portion where buds are produced. So eventually the ginger that we are consuming are the buds which are produced from the nodes of the ginger stem. So those are the natural vegetative reproduction. Now, there are also methods that can be used which can artificially propagate plants. And these methods are used to improve the quality and productivity of plants. These are the artificially propagated or vegetative reproduction in plants. First is cutting. Cutting can be done through leaves or stem. So it is a vegetative part, or a cutting is any vegetative part of a plant, the stem, the leaf, or the root, used to produce a new plant. In stem cutting, a branch or slip is cut from a plant and placed in water or moist sand. Usually, the bottom of the cutting is dipped into hormones or to stimulate root growth. In leaf cutting, a leaf of a leaf part of a plant is placed in water or moist soil, and after a while, a new plant is being developed. Cutting vegetation or cutting is very essential to plants, especially to roses. Another example of artificial vegetative reproduction is what we call layering. Layering happens when a stem is bent over so that a part of it is covered with soil. After the covered part form roots, a new plant may be cut from the parent plant. Layering is used to produce such plants as raspberries, roses, and honeysuckles. It is also occurs naturally. We also have grafting and marketing as artificial vegetative reproduction to plants. Grafting grafting is the most widely used method of producing woody plants, wherein two healthy stems form different plants are taken and put together. This is done by making a spear-shaped cut on one while the other stem is cut into a middle. So eventually they are put together. After a while, these two stems being put together will merge, or their cells merge together. And by grafting, the attached stem become a part of one another, which will supply with needed water and nutrients for its nourishment. Grafting is used to propagate roses, oranges, and grapes. While marketing is done by removing a portion of the bark of a healthy stem and use coconut husk plastic with soil to cover it. And as time goes by, eventually this portion, which has been marketed, will eventually grow its root. And that's the time that they will be cutting that branch and eventually put into the ground. So, these are the different parts or different artificial vegetative reproduction. But then there are also non-flowering plants that produce through sexually or sexually produced. We call them spore-bearing plants. As examples, we have ferns and mosses. Eventually, fern and mosses are non-flowering plants, but they are reproducing sexually. These are seed-bearing plants that lacked the combination of specialized features that characterize flowering plants. So in other words, they are called gymnosperms, but then they are producing sexually. This means that they are naked seed. So ferns and mosses are considered to be bryophytes. When we say bryophytes, they are small and non-vascular plants such as, okay, they are small and non-vascular plants. So how do they reproduce? I have here videos wherein they can be or showing you how do they reproduce, and let's watch them.
Life cycle of a fern polypodium plant. Ferns. Ferns are the simple plants, for example, polypodium plant that is known as an ornamental plant, and also the adiantum plant that is grown on the edges of the wells and shaded streams. The life cycle of polypodium starts with the sporophyte that is differentiated into transverse roots, subterranean stems called rhizome, and green leaves. There are on the lower surface of its leaves a group of sporangia called sori. These sporangia containing numerous diploid spore cells, which are symbolized by 2N. Each spore cell divides meiotically to form 4 haploid spores N. On the spores maturation, they are released from the sporangia and carried by the wind to far distances. When the spore falls on a wet soil, it germinates, forming several cells that differentiate into a flat body in the form of heart shape, called the gametophyte. The gametophyte carries rhizoids on its lower surface that penetrate the soil to absorb water and salts, and on the anterior region of its lower surface, the genital organs, gonads, grow, and there are 2 types, which are male organs called antheridia and the female organs called archegonia. After maturation, the male gametes are released from antheridia, known as ciliated sperms, that swim over the soil water till they reach the mature archegonia to fertilize the egg, forming the zygote, which is diploid 2N. The zygote divides mitotically to form a new sporophyte that grows over the gametophyte and depends on it for a short time till it develops its own roots, stem, and leaves, and the gametophyte starts to degenerate while the sporophyte grows to repeat the life cycle. So the life cycle of polypodium is considered a typical example for the phenomenon of alternation of generations, where there is a diploid sporophyte phase 2N that reproduces asexually by spores and alternates with a haploid gametophyte phase that reproduces sexually by gametes.
A moss, like all other plants, undergoes a complex life cycle in which the generations alternate between haploid and diploid forms. The most familiar form of the moss is the leafy haploid form, called the gametophyte. Gametophytes are either male or female. The male gametophyte produces male gametes, sperm, inside reproductive structures called antheridia. The haploid gametophyte produces these haploid sperm by mitosis. The female gametophyte produces a female gamete or egg inside each of many female reproductive structures called archegonia. Like the sperm, the eggs are haploid and are produced by mitosis. The sexual reproduction of a moss requires water, which is one reason mosses are typically found in moist environments. Sperm cells require water for transport to egg cells. Once in the vicinity of an egg, a sperm cell swims to the egg and fertilizes the egg by fusing with it. The fusion produces a diploid zygote, the first cell of the next generation, called the sporophyte generation. The zygote divides by mitosis and grows into a multicellular sporophyte. During the life of the sporophyte, it remains attached to the gametophyte and depends on the gametophyte for water and nutrients. As the sporophyte continues to grow and elongate, the surrounding gametophyte tissue keeps pace, but eventually cracks at its middle. The remaining hood-like tissue at the tip, called the calyptra, protects the growing sporophyte. Underneath the calyptra grows a sporangium filled with thousands of spores. The spores are haploid and are produced when diploid cells of the sporophyte undergo meiosis. When the top of the sporangium is shed, it reveals a ring of teeth-like structures holding in the spores. These teeth are highly responsive to humidity. They arch in and then out again as they absorb water and then dry out. Each time the teeth open out, the spores are released to the wind. A spore that lands on moist ground will germinate, producing a filamentous elongating structure called a protonema. This protonema gives rise to buds, which in turn develop into the next haploid gametophyte generation. The gametophytes in this generation will mate and continue the alternation of generations.
What can you say on the reproduction on moss and ferns? You see, moss and ferns are non-flowering plants, but then they reproduce sexually. They use their gametes in order for them to reproduce, sperms and egg cells. So I am telling you this because this is also important, because moss and ferns are important also to living things, especially to their fellow plants, because they do give nourishments into the ground, which give also nourishments to the plants. So you see how these materials, or so these plants used their gametophytes to grow themselves or to reproduce themselves. So going back to the non-flowering plants on how they reproduce, they eventually reproduce asexually. And they call it vegetative reproduction. Vegetative reproduction has two ways. We have natural and artificial. For natural, we have the bulb, tuber, rhizomes, shoots or suckers, and runners. And for artificial reproduction or vegetative reproduction, we have cutting, layering, grafting, and marketing. I hope we were able to spot into the learning targets for today, that we were able to identify and describe the different methods of reproduction in non-flowering plants, and of course, we were able to describe the mode of reproduction in moss and fern. So do you have any questions? If you have, then Genio is open for you. You may use the message feature to send your queries or questions to me. You may also use our synchronous time for asking questions. Of course, to share what you have learned with your logical and mathematical intelligence, try to answer or share your learning or your knowledge in our scientific activity shared blog. And of course, to end up the lesson, we will wrap up by the thumbs it. So thank you very much, grade 5 students, for your participation for this whole week. Have a science terrific day. Happy weekend and God bless.